The night it happened, the air was strangely still, too still, as if the world was holding its breath. I remember sitting by the window, my knitting half finished in my lap, and watching the last embers of the sunset fade behind the trees. The sky had turned the color of copper, glowing softly before sinking into darkness. My husband, Thomas, was sitting by the fire, reading the newspaper like he always did, his glasses slipping halfway down his nose. It was such an ordinary evening, peaceful, familiar, wrapped in the kind of quiet that feels safe. I had no idea it was the last time I'd ever feel that way. Thomas had spent the whole day fixing the old fence by the barn, and his hands still smelled faintly of wood and oil. He looked tired, but there was that gentle smile on his face, the one he always wore when he saw me watching him. "You should rest, Liv," he said softly. "You've been up since dawn." I smiled back and told him I would, after I finished my scarf. We'd been married for 43 years, and still, every small thing he said felt like a piece of love stitched into my heart. Outside, the wind began to pick up. The old oak tree near the porch creaked, and a few loose shingles rattled. I remember thinking we should call someone to fix the roof before winter. Funny how we plan for the smallest things, never realizing that by morning, none of it will matter. It was a little after 10 when I decided to make some tea. The kettle had just started to whistle when I smelled it. Smoke. At first I thought it was coming from the fireplace. I turned to tell Thomas to check the chimney, but before I could speak, I saw the reflection of orange light dancing across the window pane. My heart froze. "Thomas," I whispered. He looked up, confused, then turned toward the window. The next few seconds are a blur burned into my memory. The sound of glass cracking, the smell of burning wood, and the sudden, terrifying realization that the back of the house was on fire. Thomas ran to the back door, shouting for me to grab my coat. I remember fumbling, my hands shaking so badly I dropped the teapot. The floor hissed as the hot water met the growing smoke. I could hear the flames now, roaring, angry, alive. It's strange how fire sounds like a living thing when it's close. He tried to reach the kitchen, but the doorway was already filled with smoke. "Go, Olivia," he yelled. "Get outside." I remember his voice, strong but frightened, like he was trying to be brave for both of us. I stumbled toward the front door, coughing, my eyes burning. The house that had been our whole world, every photo, every piece of our life, was disappearing into flames. I reached the porch and turned around. Thomas wasn't behind me. I screamed his name over and over, but the fire swallowed my voice. The heat was unbearable. It felt like the air itself was burning my skin. I tried to go back in, but the door frame collapsed, sparks flying around me like angry stars. I don't know how long I stood there frozen in the cold night, watching the fire devour everything we built together. My knees gave out and I fell to the ground, clutching the small locket I always wore, the one with our wedding photo inside. The sky was glowing red, and I could hear the faint sound of sirens in the distance. The firefighters arrived too late. They pulled me away, wrapped me in a blanket, and kept asking if anyone else was inside. I couldn't answer. I just stared at the flames, whispering his name. Thomas. My Thomas. By dawn, there was nothing left but blackened wood and smoke rising into the pale morning sky. The place where our kitchen used to be, where we shared breakfast every day for 40 years, was now just a pile of ashes. One of the men came to me, gently, his eyes full of pity. He didn't need to say it, but he did. They had found him. I don't remember much after that. Just silence. A silence so heavy it pressed against my chest like a stone. They said it must have started from an old wire near the barn. An accident, they called it. But how can something that takes your whole life away in one night be called an accident? In the days that followed, I stayed at a neighbor's house. I couldn't bear to close my eyes because every time I did, I saw the flames. I heard his voice calling my name, the sound of wood cracking, the world collapsing around me. I would wake up gasping, clutching my locket, whispering that I was sorry. Sorry for leaving. Sorry for living. People came with casseroles and condolences, with gentle voices and sad eyes. They told me I was lucky to be alive. Lucky. That word stung more than anything. How could I be lucky when the only person who ever made this world feel like home was gone? At night, I'd sit by the window of the small guest room where I was staying. I'd look at the empty hill where our house once stood, the smoke long gone, but the image of it still burning in my heart. I couldn't cry anymore. My tears had run out. All that was left was the ache, deep, steady, endless. Sometimes I'd hear his voice in the wind, soft and familiar. "Live," he'd whisper. Like he used to when we danced in the kitchen. I'd close my eyes and whisper back, "I'm here." For a moment, I could almost feel his hand in mine, warm and steady. Then the wind would fade, and I'd be alone again. The days turned into weeks, and the world kept moving as if nothing had happened. The birds still sang in the mornings, the postman still came by, and children still laughed down the street. But inside me, time had stopped. I was living in that night, the fire, the loss, the sound of everything I loved turning to ash. They say grief comes in waves, but for me, it felt like drowning. I tried to remember how to breathe without him, how to move, how to exist. Every breath was a reminder that he wasn't taking one anymore. One afternoon, I went back to the remains of the house. The smell of smoke still lingered in the air, even though the wind had carried most of it away. I walked through the ruins, my feet crunching on bits of charred wood. The fireplace was still standing, blackened but solid, the same place where Thomas had sat reading just hours before the fire. I ran my fingers along the bricks, still stained with soot, and whispered, "I'm sorry." I don't know how long I stayed there. Maybe hours, maybe minutes. But when I finally turned to leave, I picked up a small piece of burned wood from the floor, the last remnant of our home. I kept it with me, tucked beside my locket. It was all I had left. That night, for the first time since it happened, I looked up at the stars. They were bright, endless, unbothered by my sorrow. Somewhere up there, I imagined, Thomas was watching me, telling me to keep going, but I didn't know how. I didn't know where to begin. All I knew was that the fire had taken everything. My home, my husband, and the part of me that believed I'd ever smile again. The days after the fire moved like ghosts, silent, shapeless, haunting every corner of my mind. Each morning, I woke before dawn, not because I wanted to, but because sleep refused to stay. The quiet was unbearable. It pressed against my chest until I had to open the window just to let in the sound of wind, of something alive. I stayed at the neighbor's house for a while. Kind people, the McKinleys. They left tea by my door each morning and never asked questions. I think they understood that sometimes grief doesn't need words. It just needs space. But every time I looked out their kitchen window and saw the hill where our house once stood, my heart broke all over again. The land looked naked without it, stripped of memory, stripped of love. I tried to keep busy. That's what people said would help. "Keep your hands moving, Olivia," they'd tell me. "It'll ease your mind." So I folded clothes that weren't mine, swept floors that didn't belong to me, and pretended that the ache in my chest was something ordinary, something time could heal. But time didn't heal. It only stretched, slow and cruel. One morning, I found myself walking toward the ruins. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to be close to him, or maybe I still didn't believe it was real. The air was cold, and a thin fog curled over the ground. When I reached what used to be the porch, I stopped. The wooden steps were gone, only ash and broken nails left behind. I knelt, my knees sinking into the dirt, and ran my hand over the earth. Beneath my fingers were fragments of our life. A cracked piece of our wedding china, a rusted doorknob, the corner of a picture frame melted by the fire. I picked up the frame carefully, brushing off the soot. The photo inside was gone, turned to dust. I didn't cry. I just sat there, holding what was left, my heart empty. I whispered his name, Thomas, and the wind answered with a low sigh through the trees. They told me I could rebuild, that insurance would cover most of it, that it would be good for me to start fresh. But I couldn't bear the thought of living on that land again. It didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a grave. So I moved into a small apartment in town, above an old tailor's shop. The walls smelled of fabric and cedar, and the windows looked out over Main Street. It wasn't much, but it was quiet. Too quiet. I filled the silence with the ticking of an old clock, with the sound of the kettle boiling, with memories I didn't want but couldn't let go of. Some nights I'd wake to the faint smell of smoke. I'd sit up, heart pounding, only to realize it was a dream. The fire still lived in me, like a scar that refused to fade. I began sleeping with the light on, afraid of the dark, not because of monsters, but because darkness was where the memories waited. I stopped going to church for a while. I couldn't face the prayers, the hymns, the gentle pity in people's eyes. They meant well, but every "I'm so sorry" felt like another stone added to the weight I was already carrying. One Sunday, months after the fire, I finally walked there again. The church bell rang as I entered, and the smell of candle wax filled the air. I sat in the last pew, far from everyone else. The pastor spoke about faith, about how God takes and gives for reasons we may never understand. His words washed over me like rain on stone. I heard them, but they didn't sink in. After the service, an older woman named Rose came to sit beside me. She'd lost her husband years ago. She didn't say anything, just took my hand in hers. It was such a small gesture, but it felt like the first real moment of comfort I'd had since the fire. Her touch said what words never could. "You're not alone." That night, when I returned to my apartment, I opened the box that held the few things I'd saved. My locket, the burned piece of wood, a half-melted teacup that somehow survived. I placed them on the table and stared at them for a long time. Then I whispered, "I miss you, Thomas. Every breath, every hour." I began talking to him more after that. Not out loud when people were around. I wasn't ready for their looks. But in the quiet of my home, in the early mornings when the sun first touched the window, I'd tell him about the weather, about the people downstairs, about how I'd burned the toast again. It made the emptiness feel less hollow. Weeks turned into months. The world outside bloomed into spring, but inside me, it was still winter. One afternoon, I went to the park, the same one Thomas and I used to walk through on Sundays. The benches were new, the trees taller, but everything else felt the same. I sat by the pond and watched children feed the ducks. For the first time in a long while, I felt something stir in me, a quiet longing not just for what was gone,
but for what might still be ahead. When I returned home that evening, I noticed a small flyer pinned to the notice board by the tailor shop. Community kitchen. Volunteers needed. Help cook for those in need. I don't know why, but I tore the flyer down and kept it. Maybe because it mentioned cooking, something I hadn't done properly since the fire. Thomas always loved my cooking. "Liv, your pot roast could make angels jealous," he used to say. The next day, I walked into the church basement where the community kitchen was set up. The smell of soup and freshly baked bread filled the air. People were laughing, moving quickly, busy with pots and trays. I stood by the door for a moment, unsure if I belonged. Then a young woman turned, smiled, and said, "You here to help, ma'am?" Her kindness disarmed me. "I suppose I am," I replied. They gave me an apron and a cutting board. My hands trembled a little at first, but once I started chopping vegetables, I felt something I hadn't in months: purpose. The sound of the knife against the board, the smell of onions and broth, the gentle hum of voices, it all felt alive. And for the first time since the fire, I didn't feel completely lost. After everyone had eaten, one of the volunteers offered me a ride home. I declined, choosing instead to walk. The evening air was cool, and the sunset painted the sky in soft gold. I thought about Thomas, how he would have smiled to see me there, helping others, doing something again. When I reached my apartment, I looked up at the stars and whispered, "I cooked again, love." It was small, maybe even silly, but it mattered. It was a step, the first fragile step towards something like healing. The pain didn't vanish. It never does. But that night, as I sat by the window with my tea, I realized that grief wasn't just about what was taken. It was also about learning how to live with what remains. I still missed him. I always would. But somewhere deep inside, a small voice, maybe his, maybe mine, whispered, "You're still here, Olivia. Keep going." And for the first time, I believed I could.
The next few weeks at the community kitchen became a kind of rhythm for me. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I walked down to the church basement, tied on my apron, and worked alongside people whose names I barely knew, yet whose smiles began to feel familiar. I chopped vegetables, stirred soups, served meals to strangers who often looked as lost as I once felt. There was something soothing in it, the routine, the warmth, the simple act of feeding others. It gave my hands something to do, and slowly, it began to give my heart something to hold on to again. It was on one of those quiet afternoons that I met him, not in the way one meets someone to fall in love, but in the way two broken souls sometimes recognize each other. His name was Samuel. He was a retired carpenter, tall and gentle, with eyes that seemed to carry their own story of loss. He had the kind of voice that was low and steady, the kind that made silence feel less heavy. The first time we spoke, he handed me a basket of bread rolls and said, "Careful, they're still hot." I smiled faintly, more out of politeness than anything. But something about his tone, the warmth of it, lingered after he walked away. Over the next few weeks, we ended up side by side at the serving table, more often than not. We didn't talk much at first, just small things: the weather, the soup, the smell of cinnamon from the pies cooling by the window. But with each shared smile, the air between us began to soften. One evening, after everyone had gone, I stayed behind to wipe down the tables. Samuel was sweeping the floor. The sound of the broom brushing against the tiles filled the room, steady and calm. "You don't have to do that," I told him. "I can finish." He looked up and smiled, a quiet, almost tired smile. "I don't mind," he said. "It helps me think." I understood that. Grief has a way of making even silence feel crowded, and work becomes a way to keep it at bay. We started talking more after that. Little by little, the conversation stretched longer.
about his late wife, Margaret, who had passed 5 years earlier from illness, about the house he built for her with his own hands, about how he hadn't picked up a hammer since she was gone. When he spoke of her, his eyes softened in the same way mine did whenever I said Thomas's name. There was an unspoken understanding between us, that kind of grief only those who've lost a piece of their soul can recognize in another. Sometimes he'd bring me coffee before we started the morning prep. 2 sugars, right? He'd ask. I'd nod, surprised he remembered. Small things like that started to matter more than I expected. They reminded me that kindness still existed, even in the quiet aftermath of pain. One Thursday, the church kitchen ran out of flour. Samuel offered to drive to the next town to pick up more. I insisted on going along, partly to help, partly because I didn't want to sit alone. The drive was peaceful, the late spring sunlight flickering through the trees as we passed. The radio played softly, old country tunes that made me think of slow dances in our living room years ago. At one point, he said, "You know, Olivia, I used to think life ended the moment she died. I didn't want to see another sunrise. But here we are, still breathing, still moving." His words lingered in the air like a truth I hadn't been ready to face. I looked out the window and whispered, "Sometimes I still feel guilty for that." He nodded. "Me too." When we returned, we carried the bags into the kitchen together. The others had already gone home, and the sun was setting through the stained glass windows, painting the room in gold and rose. We stood there for a moment, just watching the light. It was so still, so gentle. I felt something stir inside me. Not happiness exactly, but something close to peace. That evening, when I got home, I made tea and sat by the window. The city was quiet, and the stars were beginning to appear. I thought about Samuel's words, still breathing, still moving. For the first time, I realized that surviving wasn't a curse. It was a kind of promise to carry their memory forward by continuing to live. Over the next months, the kitchen became our shared routine. We laughed sometimes, real laughter that surprised me. One day, while kneading dough, I accidentally dropped flour all over the counter, and all over him. He blinked, covered in white, then burst out laughing. The sound filled the room, deep and warm, and I couldn't help but laugh with him until my sides ached. It had been so long since I'd laughed like that, I almost didn't recognize the sound of my own joy. Summer came, bringing with it the smell of rain and wildflowers. Samuel began fixing small things around the church, a loose door hinge, a creaking step, a window that wouldn't shut properly. Watching him work reminded me of Thomas, the quiet focus, the patience, the way he hummed under his breath. But it didn't hurt to be reminded anymore. It felt comforting, like remembering sunlight after a storm. One afternoon, after the day's meals were served, Samuel asked me if I'd like to visit the garden behind the church. "You've probably never noticed it." I hadn't. I followed him outside, past the side gate, and there it was, a small patch of earth surrounded by ivy-covered fences. Someone had once tended it with care, but now weeds had taken over. He knelt, touched the soil, and said, "It used to be beautiful. Maybe it could be again." Something about that struck me deeply. Maybe it could be again. The words echoed inside me long after I returned home. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about that little garden and how it felt like a reflection of my own heart, burned, overgrown, but maybe still capable of growing something new. So, the next week, I brought a small packet of seeds with me, lavender, Thomas's favorite. When I showed him, he smiled quietly. Together we began to clear the weeds, our hands dirty, our backs aching, but our hearts lighter somehow. Day by day, the garden began to change, color returning, life slowly taking root again. People started coming by to sit on the benches, enjoying the scent of flowers in bloom. It became a quiet place, a sanctuary for anyone who needed a moment of peace. And in that small corner of earth, I found pieces of myself returning too. Each sprout, each bloom, felt like proof that healing didn't happen all at once. It happened gently, in small, almost invisible ways. One evening, when the lavender had finally blossomed, I sat in the garden alone after everyone had gone. The air was warm, the sky painted in shades of amber. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Thomas, can you see this?" In my heart, I felt him there, not in the way of ghosts or memories, but in a quiet warmth that wrapped around me like the soft glow of sunset. When I opened my eyes, Samuel was standing by the gate, watching me with that calm smile of his. He didn't say anything, just nodded, as if he understood everything I was feeling without a word. And in that silence, I realized that though grief had changed me, it hadn't destroyed me. Somewhere between loss and renewal, I had learned to live again. That night, as I walked home under the stars, I didn't feel alone anymore. The ache was still there, yes, it always would be, but it no longer hollowed me out. It simply sat beside me, gentle and familiar, like an old friend reminding me where I'd been and how far I'd come. And for the first time since that night of fire, I found myself whispering, not in sorrow, but in gratitude. For the kindness of strangers, for the resilience of a tired heart, for the lavender blooming in the garden behind the church, and for the quiet, enduring truth that even after everything burns, something beautiful can still grow from the ashes.
Years later, I sit in the same garden, now filled with children's laughter and blooming lavender. The house is gone, Thomas is gone, but love still lives here, in every petal, every breeze. Samuel tends the roses, humming softly, and I smile, knowing peace has finally stayed. Grief taught me how fragile we are, but life taught me how strong love can be. From the ashes, I did not just survive, I learned how to live again.